Discovered bruised and unconscious on the outskirts of a town, an orphan girl is brought to a small-town hospital. After days in a coma, she wakes and whispers one word, sending shockwaves down the hospital. As the nurse runs to call 911, a shocking detail from her past emerges. Who is this girl, and why was she left abandoned in the middle of nowhere? What did she whisper into the nurse's ears? As a nurse digs into her past, he discovers an abandoned facility, forgotten experiments on children, and a secret so sinister that those who uncover it rarely survive. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The storm unleashed its fury over Pine Grove Community Hospital, rain pelting against windows like angry fists demanding entry. Thunder crashed overhead as two paramedics burst through the emergency room doors, their uniforms drenched and their faces grim. On the stretcher between them lay a small, motionless figure, a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Nathan had been updating patient charts at the nurse's station when he heard the commotion. He rushed toward the emergency room, his heart quickening at the sight of the child. Her clothes were caked with mud, her dark hair matted against her pale face. Ugly purple bruises marked her exposed skin, telling a story that made his stomach clench. "Found at the edge of Blackwood Forest," one of the paramedics reported to Dr. Malcolm, who was already pulling on examination gloves. "Hikers spotted her just before sunset. No ID, nothing in her pockets." Nathan moved closer, his trained eyes taking in every detail. The girl's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her small frame looking even tinier against the white hospital sheets. Her feet were bare and scratched, her jeans torn at the knees. Severe contusions? Possible internal injuries? Dr. Malcolm muttered, his experienced hands moving efficiently over the girl's body. "Get me a full set of vitals. Nathan, start an IV line." The emergency room buzzed with controlled urgency as the team worked to stabilize their mysterious patient. Hours passed before the immediate danger subsided, but the girl remained unconscious, lost in a deep coma that held her just beyond their reach. 3 days later, they moved her to a private room in the pediatric wing. The police had come and gone, taking photos and fingerprints, but their searches turned up nothing. No missing person reports matched the girl's description. No concerned parents called. No one seemed to be looking for this lost child. Nathan found himself drawn to her room during his breaks. Something about her vulnerability tugged at his heart, reminding him of all the reasons he'd become a nurse in the first place. He'd pull up a chair beside her bed, sometimes reading to her from children's books she borrowed from the pediatric playroom, other times just sitting in companionable silence. It was during one of these quiet moments that he first noticed the eastern blue jay. The beautiful bird landed on the windowsill, its bright feathers a stark contrast to the sterile hospital environment. It tilted its head, studying the room's occupants with curious black eyes. "Well, hello there," Nathan whispered, not wanting to startle it. The bird stayed, preening its feathers, seemingly content to keep watch over the sleeping child. Day after day, the blue jay returned, always to the same window, always at the same time. Nathan began to see it as a sign of hope, a splash of life and color in their otherwise uncertain situation. "I think I'll call you Little Jay," he told the unconscious girl one afternoon, stroking her hand gently. "Until we learn your real name." He started keeping a journal documenting everything about her case. His neat handwriting filled page after page with medical observations, personal notes, and questions that kept him awake at night. He recorded her vital signs, the healing progress of her bruises, and something else, something he wasn't quite sure how to explain. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun slanted through the window just right, her skin seemed to shimmer like moonlight on water. Dr. Malcolm remained professionally detached, though Nathan could see the concern in his eyes whenever he reviewed the girl's unchanged condition. "Don't get too attached," he warned him one evening, catching him during his third unofficial visit of the day. "We don't know her story." But it was too late for such warnings. Nathan was already invested, determined to solve the mystery of Little Jay and her origins. The hospital staff whispered their theories, abuse, abandonment, runaway. But he felt there was something more to the story, something they were all missing. That night, as he prepared to end his shift, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows as Nathan made his final rounds, pausing in Little Jay's doorway. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring her sleeping form. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and lightning illuminated the room in brief, brilliant flashes. The blue jay appeared suddenly, tapping urgently at the window pane, its feathers ruffled by the storm. On the bed, a faint shimmer passed over Little Jay's bruised arm, like starlight rippling beneath her skin. But Nathan had already turned away, pulling the door closed behind him. Nathan's voice filled the quiet hospital room as he read from a worn copy of The Wind in the Willows. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting warm patches of light across Little Jay's bed. He had been reading to her for nearly an hour, pausing occasionally to check her vital signs or adjust her blanket. "There is nothing, absolutely nothing half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats," he read, his voice gentle and clear. A passing nurse gave him a pitying look through the door's window, but Nathan paid no attention. He was used to the whispers and concerned glances from his colleagues by now. Mid-sentence he stopped. Jay's index finger had moved, just slightly, just enough to make his heart skip a beat. He leaned forward, watching intently, his own hand hovering over hers. "Jay," he whispered, hope rising in his chest, "can you hear me?" The movement didn't repeat, but Nathan was certain he hadn't imagined it. He hurried to find Dr. Malcolm, who was reviewing charts at the nurse's station. "Her finger moved," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. "I saw it while I was reading to her." Dr. Malcolm looked up from his papers, his expression kind but skeptical. "Nathan, you know as well as I do that coma patients can experience involuntary muscle reflexes. It doesn't necessarily indicate consciousness." This was different," Nathan insisted. "It happened right as I was reading to her. It felt responsive." The doctor sighed, setting down his pen. "I understand you've grown attached to the little girl, but we need to maintain realistic expectations." Over the next few days, Nathan spent even more time in Jay's room. He brought a small ceramic blue jay figurine from home, placing it on her bedside table next to the vase of fresh flowers he changed weekly. The real blue jay continued its daily visits, and Nathan found himself talking to both the bird and Jay, sharing stories about his day and his hopes for her recovery. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. During a staff meeting, the hospital director cleared his throat and addressed the elephant in the room. "We need to discuss the John Doe in room 412, he said, shuffling through his papers. "We've been providing intensive care for nearly 2 weeks with no improvement and no payment source identified. I recommend we begin transfer proceedings to county long-term care." Nathan stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "She's showing signs of improvement," he argued, his voice firm despite his racing heart. "Just yesterday, I noticed movement in her eyelids during routine checks." "Nurse Matthews," the director said, his tone patronizing, "we appreciate your dedication, but we need to be practical about resource allocation." "She's a child," Nathan countered, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table. "We can't just ship her off to a facility where she'll be treated like a number. She needs personalized care, attention, and time to heal." Dr. Malcolm, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Nathan has been monitoring her closely. Perhaps we could give it another week before making any decisions?" The director frowned, but Nathan pressed his advantage. "1 week. That's all I'm asking. She's young. Her body is still healing. Sometimes recovery just takes time." After several tense moments of discussion, the board agreed to postpone any transfer decisions for 7 days. Nathan felt a small victory, but he knew the clock was ticking. Back in Jay's room, Nathan adjusted her pillows and straightened her blankets. The afternoon light caught her skin in that peculiar way again, creating that subtle shimmer he'd noticed before. In the corner of his eye, he thought he saw shadows shifting unusually, but when he turned to look, everything was normal. He leaned close to Jay's ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone. I'll wait as long as it takes." The Blue Jay appeared at the window, right on schedule, as if affirming his promise. The steady patter of rain against the hospital windows created a soothing rhythm as Nathan made his evening rounds. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, casting long shadows in the empty hallways. As he approached Jay's room, he stopped abruptly. A tall figure in a dark trench coat stood motionless near Jay's door, his presence jarring in the otherwise deserted corridor. "Can I help you?" Nathan asked, his voice steady, despite the sudden unease in his stomach. The man turned slowly. His face was angular, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. "Ah, yes. I'm a concerned citizen." His voice was smooth, almost too controlled. "I read about the girl in the papers." Nathan shifted his weight, positioning himself between the stranger and Jay's door. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over, and we can't discuss patients with anyone who isn't family." Of course, the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I just wondered if there had been any changes in her condition. Has she spoken at all? Were there any unusual items found with her?" "As I said, I can't discuss patient information," Nathan replied firmly. "If you'd like to leave your name and contact information, that won't be necessary." The man took a step closer, and Nathan caught a whiff of something that smelled like burnt matches. "But surely you've noticed something different about her." Nathan's heart pounded as he watched the stranger drift toward Jay's room window. He pressed his hand against the glass, staring intently at the sleeping girl. The sleeve of his coat slipped slightly, revealing what looked like a tattoo on his wrist, an intricate design of an eye within a triangle. "I need to ask you to leave," Nathan said, reaching for his phone to call security. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." When he looked up from his phone, the hallway was empty. Nathan blinked, momentarily confused by his sudden disappearance. He hurried to the security office, where Officer Martinez pulled up the surveillance footage. They watched as the strange man appeared on camera, his movements oddly fluid. The footage clearly showed his interaction with Nathan and the moment he stood at Jay's window. Then, just as Nathan had experienced, he simply walked away and disappeared around a corner, though none of the other cameras picked him up after that. "There," Nathan pointed, rewinding the footage. "So did you see his tattoo?" Officer Martinez leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the grainy image. "Yeah, some kind of eye symbol. Weird." Later, when Nathan showed the footage to Dr. Malcolm in his office, he merely shrugged. Probably just some true crime enthusiast who read about the case. These stories tend to attract all sorts of amateur detectives. "But the way he asked about Jay," Nathan insisted, like he knew something, "and that tattoo—" "Nathan," Dr. Malcolm interrupted gently. "I understand your concern, but we can't jump at shadows. The girl is safe here." In the break room, Nathan sat alone with a cold cup of coffee, replaying the encounter in his mind. The strange man's questions echoed in his thoughts, along with the unsettling image of that tattoo. Thunder rolled outside, and the rain intensified, drumming against the windows with renewed force. In Jay's room, unnoticed by anyone, the familiar shimmer on her skin began to spread, creeping across her arms like moonlight on water. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jay's room as Nathan entered, carrying his usual stack of books and notes. His footsteps echoed in the quiet space as he approached her bed, ready to begin their daily routine. But something was different. Jay's eyes were open. Nathan froze, his books tumbling from his arms to the floor with a loud thud. Her blue eyes, wide and alert, stared directly at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. But it wasn't joy or confusion in those eyes. It was pure, unbridled terror. "Jay," he whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for the call button. "Can you hear me?" Her lips parted, dry and cracked, and a single word escaped in a hoarse whisper. "Run." The monitors began beeping frantically as Jay's body suddenly jerked upward, her back arching off the bed. Nathan slammed the emergency button repeatedly as violent convulsions took hold of her small frame. Dr. Malcolm burst through the door with two nurses close behind. "What happened?" he demanded, rushing to Jay's bedside. She was awake. She spoke. Nathan's voice shook as he backed away to give the medical team room. She just said run, and then the room filled with urgent voices and the clatter of medical equipment. "She's seizing. Get me 5 milliliters of diazepam stat," Dr. Malcolm ordered, working to stabilize Jay's thrashing body. Nathan felt overwhelmed by the chaos, his heart pounding in his ears. "I'll call for additional support," he managed to say, though no one seemed to hear him over the commotion. He stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. As he waited for the call to connect, his eyes drifted to the window at the end of the corridor. His blood ran cold. There he was, the man with the tattoo standing near the hospital entrance. His dark coat billowed slightly in the morning breeze as he stared up at him, completely still. Even from this distance, he could feel the weight of his gaze. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. Nathan backed away from the window, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The sound of alarms from Jay's room snapped him back to reality. He rushed back inside to find the medical team still working, but Jay was unconscious again. Dr. Malcolm was checking his vitals while nurses adjusted her IV and monitoring equipment. "She's stabilized," Dr. Malcolm announced, wiping his brow. "But she's completely unresponsive again." "Nathan, you said she spoke?" Nathan nodded, moving closer to Jay's bed. "Yes, just one word." He didn't mention what the word was, suddenly unsure of who he could trust. As the medical team gradually filtered out of the room, Nathan remained by Jay's side. The shimmer on her skin, which he'd noticed weeks ago, was now clearly visible, pulsing faintly. Outside, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered, and when Nathan glanced out the window, the mysterious stranger had vanished into the shadows. He reached for Jay's small hand, holding it tightly in his own. His jaw set with determination as he watched her peaceful face, now showing no sign of the terror that had filled it moments ago. Whatever was happening, whatever danger lurked outside these walls, Nathan knew one thing for certain. He would protect this child with everything he had. Nathan's fingers trembled as he punched the numbers into his phone, his back pressed against the peeling wallpaper of the hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows across the worn carpet. From inside the room behind him, Jay's labored breathing seemed to grow more strained with each passing moment. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's steady voice cut through Nathan's panic like a lifeline. "There's been an attack," Nathan whispered, his eyes fixed on the hallway's end. "A man in a dark trench coat. He followed us. He tried to—" His voice caught as the memory of Jay's terrified face flashed through his mind. "Sir, are you safe right now?" The dispatcher's professional tone helped Nathan focus. "Yes, we're at the hospital on Route 16, room 112. Nathan described the attacker in detail, emphasizing the distinctive eye-within triangle tattoo on his wrist. "Please hurry. The girl I'm with is hurt." "Officers are being dispatched to your location," the dispatcher assured him. "Stay on the line with me." Nathan's gaze darted to the door, its thin wood frame suddenly seeming terribly inadequate. Every creak of the old building made him flinch, imagining the stranger's footsteps coming closer. A sudden noise from inside the room made Nathan spin around. Jay was awake, her small frame propped up on trembling arms. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room as if tracking invisible movements through the air. "I need to check on her," Nathan told the dispatcher, hurrying to Jay's side. Jay's hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Her skin felt ice cold, and the familiar shimmer seemed to pulse more intensely than ever before. "They're coming," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes locked onto his with an urgency that made his blood run cold. "Who's coming, Jay? Who are they?" Nathan pleaded, but her eyes were already rolling back as consciousness slipped away from her once more. Her hand fell limply to her side. Nathan resumed his pacing, phone still pressed to his ear. He checked the windows, making sure the curtains were fully drawn. The door's flimsy chain lock seemed laughably inadequate, so he wedged a chair under the handle. The officers should be arriving soon. The dispatcher's voice reminded him of the outside world. "Can you tell me more about the girl's condition?" Nathan described Jay's injuries, his professional nursing training helping him remain clinical despite his racing heart. But her warning echoed in his mind, making it hard to concentrate. They're coming. Not he's coming. They. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Nathan rushed to the window and carefully peered through a gap in the curtains. The parking lot was empty except for his car, its blue paint almost black in the dim light. No sign of the man in the trench coat. The room felt smaller with each passing minute, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Jay's warning played on repeat in his thoughts as he stood guard, waiting for either help or horror to arrive first. Nathan's eyes felt heavy as he maintained his vigil in Jay's hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a steady backdrop to his troubled thoughts. The events that just occurred still haunted him, but at least here, surrounded by security and medical staff, they seemed safer. Movement caught his attention, something peeking out from Jay's hospital gown pocket. Nathan leaned forward, noticing a corner of paper. With gentle fingers, he extracted what appeared to be a crumpled note. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully unfolded it. Strange symbols covered the paper, unlike anything he'd seen before. They seemed to flow across the page in intricate patterns, some appearing to shift and change as he stared at them. Among the bizarre text, one word stood out in clear English: solace. The word struck a chord deep within his memory, though he couldn't place why. It felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream, but the more he tried to grasp the connection, the more it slipped away. Taking out his phone, Nathan snapped several photos of the note from different angles. He wanted to research these symbols later, when he had more time and resources. As he tucked the note carefully into his pocket, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the room into darkness. Nathan froze, listening to the sudden silence broken only by the continued beeping of Jay's monitors, now running on backup power. After a few tense seconds, the emergency generators kicked in, casting the room in a dim, amber glow. Outside in the hallway, confused voices echoed. "What happened to the power?" someone called out. Footsteps hurried past Jay's door as staff members rushed to check on critical patients. "Everything okay in here?" A nurse poked her head in, flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "We're fine," Nathan assured her, trying to keep his voice steady. "The monitors are still working." As the nurse hurried away, Nathan noticed how quiet the usually bustling hospital had become. Occasional voices filtered through the darkness, but they seemed distant and muffled. The emergency lights cast long shadows across Jay's unconscious form. Nathan pulled out his phone and switched on its flashlight, scanning the room. The beam caught Jay's monitors, their displays flickering weakly despite the backup power. The note in his pocket seemed to weigh heavier now, its mysteries more urgent in the darkness. He stood by Jay's bed, clutching the paper tightly. The word solace burned in his mind as he watched her chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. Something about this blackout felt wrong. Too convenient. Too complete. In the dim light, Jay's skin shimmer seemed more pronounced than ever, pulsing faintly like a distant star. In the dimly lit hospital room, Nathan stood near Jay's bed, every nerve on high alert. The emergency lights cast an amber glow that made the shadows dance across the walls like living things. The steady beeping of Jay's heart monitor suddenly changed rhythm, letting out 3 sharp, irregular tones before settling back to its normal pattern. Nathan's fingers tightened around the note in his pocket. The silence in the hallway felt heavy, broken only by the sound of footsteps, slow, purposeful steps that seemed to echo through the corridor. These weren't the hurried movements of concerned hospital staff. These steps belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. Without hesitation, Nathan moved to the door and turned the lock. He grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the handle, creating a makeshift barricade. His hands trembled slightly, but his movements were decisive. Years of nursing had taught him to act first and process emotions later. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. Nathan held his breath, counting the seconds in his head. After a moment, he crept to the window and carefully parted the blinds, peering into the parking lot below. At first, he saw only empty spaces and pools of light from scattered lampposts. Then, movement caught his eye. A familiar figure in a dark trench coat emerged from the shadows. It was him, the same man from the motel. His heart pounded against his ribs as two more figures stepped into view, dressed identically to the first. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but their stance spoke of purpose and threat. The three figures stood in a triangle formation as if conducting some silent meeting. One pointed toward the hospital's main entrance, while another gestured to the side of the building, right below Jay's window. Nathan backed away from the window, his mind racing. The monitor's glow painted ghostly patterns on the wall, and Jay lay still and vulnerable on the bed. He positioned himself between the door and her bed, his body tense with determination. Whatever these people wanted with Jay, they would have to go through him first. The sound of more footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. These came from the opposite direction, multiple sets moving with the same measured pace. Nathan realized with growing dread that they were being surrounded. The door handle to Jay's room rattled, the metallic sound piercing through the eerie silence. Nathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the IV pole, his breath caught in his throat. The cold metal felt reassuring in his hands as he positioned himself between the door and Jay's bed. Through the narrow window in the door, shadows shifted in the dim emergency lighting. The trench-coated man appeared in view, his tall figure unmistakable even in the low light. He moved past the nurse's station with two companions, their movements fluid and practiced. No one challenged them. In fact, Nathan noticed with growing unease that the usual staff seemed conspicuously absent from their posts. "This isn't right," he whispered to himself, watching as they methodically checked each room down the hallway. Their efficiency spoke of training, of preparation. These weren't common criminals or desperate relatives. They knew exactly what they were doing. Nathan crouched lower behind Jay's bed, his mind racing. The note in his pocket seemed to burn against his skin. He pulled it out with trembling fingers, studying the strange symbols again. The word solace stood out among the foreign characters, but its meaning remained frustratingly out of reach. Whatever it meant, he felt certain now that it was connected to these men's presence. The systematic sweep of the hospital continued. Through the door's window, Nathan caught glimpses of the men checking rooms with military precision. They moved like shadows, barely making a sound despite their size. Each step brought them closer to Jay's room. The soft beeping of Jay's monitors felt deafening in the tense silence. Nathan's palms grew sweaty around the IV pole as he watched another figure approach the door. The metal handle turned slowly, accompanied by the electronic whir of a key card reader. Nathan's heart thundered in his chest as he raised the pole, ready to defend Jay with everything he had. The door began to open, spilling a shaft of amber emergency lighting into the darkened room. Nathan's muscles tensed, adrenaline coursing through his body as he prepared to face whatever waited on the other side. The storm outside intensified, its rhythmic beating against the windows matching Nathan's racing heartbeat. He crouched next to Jay's bed, his muscles tense as he watched shadows moving beneath the door. The voices in the hallway grew closer, and Nathan knew they were running out of time. With practiced efficiency born from years of nursing experience, he began carefully disconnecting Jay from his monitors. He worked swiftly but methodically, using a blanket to muffle the sounds of detaching equipment. Each beep of the machine seemed thunderous in the quiet room. "What's happening?" Jay's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes struggling to focus in the dim light. "Shh, it's okay," Nathan soothed, keeping his voice low and steady, despite his racing heart. "I need to move you somewhere safe. Just trust me, all right?" Jay nodded weakly as Nathan wrapped her in a warm blanket and gently lifted her into the wheelchair he'd positioned beside the bed. Her slight frame felt fragile under his hands. reminding him of how vulnerable she still was. The hallways stretched before them like a maze in the emergency lighting. Nathan pushed the wheelchair as quietly as possible, every squeak of its wheels making him wince. They passed through the main ward, where an elderly janitor methodically mopped the floor, lost in his own world with headphones in his ears. Nathan hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should warn him, but the sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for him. As they approached the emergency exit, Nathan's heart nearly stopped. Two figures in black tactical gear appeared at the end of the corridor, their weapons clearly visible even in the low light. Without hesitation, he steered Jay's wheelchair into a nearby supply closet, carefully closing the door behind them. The small space smelled of antiseptic and cleaning supplies. Jay's breathing came in short, shallow gasps, and Nathan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He could feel him trembling beneath his touch. They listened as heavy footsteps approached their hiding spot. "Section C clear," a gruff voice spoke nearby. The sound of static crackled from what Nathan assumed was a radio or earpiece. "Moving to Section D." The footsteps passed their hiding place and gradually faded away. Nathan released the breath he'd been holding, feeling Jay relax slightly under his hand. Through the small gap under the door, he watched the shadows pass by completely, confirming it was safe to move. When they finally reached the emergency exit, Nathan pushed the door open carefully, letting in a blast of cold, rain-soaked air. The storm had intensified, sheets of rain falling steadily from the dark sky. Thunder rolled overhead as Nathan wheeled Jay out into the night, the rain immediately soaking through their clothes. They made their way down the alley beside the hospital, stopping briefly in a sheltered alcove. Jay looked up at Nathan, her wet hair plastered to her forehead, eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Why are they after me?" she asked weakly, her voice nearly lost in the sound of the storm. Nathan looked down at her, raindrops running down his face, wishing he had an answer that could ease his fears. But he knew they couldn't stay there long enough to figure it out. The night stretched before them, full of shadows and uncertainty. Nathan fumbled with his apartment keys, his hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline. The rain had soaked through their clothes, leaving puddles on his welcome mat as they entered. Droplets trickled down their faces and dripped from their hair as he guided Jay to the worn but comfortable couch. The old springs creaked beneath her weight as he quickly locked the door, checking it twice before sliding the security chain into place with trembling fingers. "Let me look at those wounds," he said softly, grabbing his first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet. The warm yellow light from his table lamp cast a gentle glow across Jay's pale face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. She winced and pulled back slightly as he carefully examined the angry red spots where her IV lines had been hastily removed. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Nathan asked, applying antiseptic to a small cut on her arm with gentle, practiced movements. "Anything you remember?" Jay's eyes darted around the room unfocused, like a frightened animal searching for escape routes. "Tests," she mumbled, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain against the windows. "So many tests." Her hands trembled as she spoke, fingers twisting in the fabric of her shirt. "What kind of tests?" Nathan pressed gently, but Jay's expression grew distant, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. "Other kids," she continued, seemingly lost in fragments of memory. "Cold rooms, white rooms, everything was white." She shuddered, pulling the blanket Nathan had given her closer around her shoulders, clutching it like armor. As Nathan cleaned another small wound, Jay suddenly grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Solace Haven," she said with unexpected clarity, her eyes briefly sharp and focused. "That's what they called it." "What is Solace Haven?" Nathan asked, but Jay's momentary lucidity had already faded like morning mist. She shook her head, confusion clouding her features again as she sank back into the couch cushions. A car horn blared outside, echoing through the quiet apartment, and Jay jumped, her whole body tensing like a coiled spring. Nathan noticed how her eyes immediately went to the windows, scanning for threats. The reaction seemed automatic, ingrained like a soldier in a war zone. Fighting his own exhaustion, Nathan retrieved his laptop from his bedroom where it sat on his cluttered desk, He settled into the armchair next to the couch, typing Solace Haven into various search engines. Page after page yielded nothing useful until he found a single reference, a brief mention of a closed research facility with no additional details. The lack of information made his stomach twist with unease. Thunder rumbled outside, rattling the window panes, and Jay flinched again, drawing her knees up to her chest. Even the sound of neighbors walking in the hallway made her sit up straighter, her eyes wide with fear. Nathan watched her, his heart aching at how her body seemed programmed to expect danger at every turn, like a frightened child who had learned too early that the world wasn't safe. "I don't remember everything," Jay whispered, pulling Nathan's attention back to her. "But there were others, like me, in the white rooms." Her voice trailed off and her eyelids began to droop with exhaustion, the day's events finally catching up with her. Nathan helped her lie down on the couch, tucking the blanket around her thin frame with fatherly care. He settled back in his chair with the laptop, staring at the screen where Solace Haven still displayed in the search bar. The single result about the research facility seemed to mock him with its vagueness, but he knew it had to mean something. Whatever secrets that name held, he was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. The pale light of dawn crept through Nathan's apartment windows as he hunched over his laptop, his eyes burning from hours of research. Coffee cups littered his small desk, testament to his determination to uncover the truth about Solace Haven. His persistence finally paid off when he stumbled upon a scan of a yellowed government document, barely legible but containing disturbing details. "Project terminated following allegations of extreme psychological and physical experimentation on orphan subjects," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. The document detailed how the facility had operated under the guise of an orphanage, conducting tests on children who had no one to protect them. Nathan's stomach churned as he glanced at Jay, still sleeping fitfully on his couch. The pieces were starting to fit together, her fear, her confusion, the strange people pursuing her. He printed the documents and gathered his courage before gently waking her. "Jay," he said softly, "I need to show you something. It might help explain what happened to you." Jay sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Nathan spread the papers on the coffee table, watching her reaction carefully as he explained what he'd found. At first, her face remained blank, but as he described the facility's stark white rooms and the experiments, her eyes widened with recognition. "The screaming," she whispered, her hands beginning to shake. "There was always screaming. And the doctors," her voice cracked. "They never looked at us like we were people, just things to study." Nathan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as she continued. "The walls were so white they hurt my eyes. And the tests," she shuddered, unable to continue. Returning to his laptop, Nathan dug deeper into the facility's history. Through various archived news articles and public records, he discovered mentions of a private contractor that had taken over certain aspects of the facility's operations. The name Crow appeared several times in connection with equipment purchases and staffing records, though details were frustratingly vague. "Does the name Crow mean anything to you?" Nathan asked, watching Jay carefully. She shook her head, but her body tensed at the word. Nathan jotted down every reference to Crow he could find, creating a timeline of their involvement with Solace Haven. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that these were the people hunting Jay. He printed everything he'd found about Crow in the facility, organizing the papers into a folder. Jay had moved to stand by the window, her reflection pale in the morning light. Nathan approached her with the folder in hand. "I think I know why they want you," he said grimly, holding the evidence of her past. Jay turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "They'll never stop," she whispered. In a dimly lit room that smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes, Crow stood over a metal table scattered with surveillance photos and detailed city maps. His fingers traced a path across one of the streets, stopping at a particular address marked in red. The harsh fluorescent light above cast deep shadows across his angular face, making his expression even more severe. "We've confirmed the nurse's address," one of his operatives reported, placing a fresh photograph on the table. "Second floor, apartment 2B. Crow nodded, his movements precise and controlled. "Move in. Bring them both back, unharmed." His voice carried the chill of authority that brooked no argument. Meanwhile, in his small apartment, Nathan sat rigid on his worn couch, watching the local news with growing dread. The reporter's voice filled the room. "Police are seeking to question a local nurse regarding the alleged abduction of a minor from Memorial Hospital. The nurse, identified as Nathan Matthews, was last seen." His own face stared back at him from the screen, a photo from his hospital ID badge. Nathan's stomach clenched as he realized their time was running out. He switched off the TV and jumped into action. "Jay, we need to move. Now." He grabbed a backpack and began stuffing it with essentials: clothes, first aid supplies, what little cash he had on hand. Jay struggled to her feet, still weak, but understanding the urgency in his voice. The sound of tires on wet pavement made Nathan freeze. He crept to the window and carefully peered through the blinds. Two men in dark suits were approaching his building, their purposeful stride telling him everything he needed to know. The shrill ring of his apartment phone cut through the tension like a knife. Jay flinched, and Nathan held his breath, letting it ring. He knew answering would only give them what they wanted: confirmation he was home. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Nathan grabbed Jay's hand and led him to the back of the apartment, where a fire escape provided their only chance of escape. The sound of someone trying to force his front door spurred them into action. "Careful," Nathan whispered as he helped Jay through the window. The metal grating of the fire escape was slick with rain, making their descent treacherous. They had barely reached the ground when shouts from above indicated they'd been spotted. Nathan pulled Jay into the maze of narrow alleyways behind his building. The sound of pursuit followed them: boots on wet pavement, voices calling out positions. Jay stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but Nathan kept them moving, ducking behind dumpsters and weaving through the urban labyrinth. A searchlight swept across the alley ahead of them, forcing them to backtrack. Nathan's heart pounded as he guided Jay through a gap between buildings barely wide enough to squeeze through. The voices of their pursuers grew closer, more urgent. After several tense minutes of cat and mouse through the rain-slicked alleys, Nathan spotted an abandoned warehouse with a broken window. He helped Jay climb through, following quickly behind her. The vast empty space echoed with their labored breathing as they crouched behind some old crates. "We can't keep running forever," Nathan whispered to herself as he checked their surroundings for any sign of movement. Outside the now empty apartment, Crow stood in the rain, examining the forced door. A slight smile played across his features as he surveyed the scene. "We'll find them," he muttered, his words carried away by the wind. Nathan's eyes burned from staring at his laptop screen for hours, the dim light of his apartment making the glow seem even harsher. Article after article about Solace Haven revealed disturbing fragments of information, but one name kept appearing in the most detailed exposés: Ethan Vance. He clicked through his previous work, impressed by the depth of his investigations into government corruption. His articles painted a picture of a man who wouldn't back down from powerful enemies. That's exactly what they needed right now. With trembling fingers, Nathan composed an email. He kept it brief but included essential details about Jay and her connection to Solace Haven. After reading it over 3 times, he hit send and waited. Jay stirred on the couch nearby, mumbling in her sleep. Nathan watched her, wondering what horrors her fragmented memories contained. Hours passed as he alternated between checking his email and researching more about Solace Haven. The buzz of his phone made him jump. The response was short: "Meet me tomorrow at the Midnight Roost Cafe. This is bigger than you think." The next morning, Nathan and Jay entered the cafe, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. The smell of coffee and pastries filled the air, but Nathan's stomach was too knotted to think about food. He spotted Ethan immediately in a corner booth. His rumpled clothes and the dark circles under his eyes matched the image of a man who'd spent years chasing dangerous truths. Ethan's sharp eyes assessed them as they approached. He gestured for them to sit, then launched into questions without preamble. "Tell me exactly what you remember," he demanded, focusing on Jay. "Every detail matters." Jay shifted uncomfortably in her seat. There were white rooms. Tests. They made us repeat something over and over. The word. Ethan's posture changed instantly, his previous skepticism replaced by alert attention. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. My colleague, my friend, died investigating Solace Haven. This goes deeper than you can imagine. People disappear just for asking the wrong questions." Nathan felt his throat tighten. "We need help. They're hunting us and we don't even know why." Ethan ran a hand through his disheveled hair, conflict clear on his face. Finally, he nodded. "I'll help you. But understand something. You're stepping into dangerous territory. You have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes." He pulled out a small notebook, jotting down notes as Jay shared more fragments of her memories. Nathan watched Ethan's expression grow grimmer with each detail. "If you're in this now, there's no turning back," Ethan warned, sliding a burner phone across the table. "Meet me tomorrow. I know a safer place to talk. Until then, stay off the grid." The early morning sun cast long shadows through Nathan's apartment windows as he methodically packed a small duffel bag. His hands moved quickly, grabbing only the essentials: medical supplies, changes of clothes, and the documents about Solace Haven. A metallic scraping sound from outside made him freeze. Carefully pulling back the curtain, his heart nearly stopped. Crow stood on the sidewalk below, his dark coat making him look like a shadow come to life. 4 men flanked him, their movements precise and predatory as they approached the building. "Jay," Nathan whispered urgently, shaking her awake, "we need to go. Now." Jay's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. They could hear footsteps in the hallway as they crept toward the back door. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the apartment as the front door gave way. Clara and Jay burst out the back entrance just as heavy boots thundered through his living room. The cool morning air hit their faces as they sprinted down the fire escape, metal clanging beneath their feet. Ethan's weathered sedan idled exactly where he said it would be, tucked behind the building. They dove into the back seat, and Ethan gunned the engine before their doors were fully closed. "Hold on," Ethan warned, throwing the car into gear. The chase wound through the awakening city. Ethan took sharp turns down narrow alleys and side streets, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 2 black SUVs stayed close behind, no matter how many turns they took. "They're not giving up," Ethan muttered, swerving onto a highway entrance ramp. A soft thump made Nathan turn. Jay had slumped against the window, her face ashen. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, clear signs of shock setting in. "Jay!" Nathan shifted into nurse mode, checking her pulse while bracing herself against Ethan's evasive driving. "She's crashing. The stress is too much." He pulled supplies from his bag, working efficiently despite the car's jerky movements. He covered Jay with his jacket to keep her warm and elevated her legs onto his lap, all while monitoring her vital signs. "How is she?" Ethan called back, weaving between cars. "Stable for now, but we need to get her somewhere safe," Nathan replied, keeping pressure on Jay's wrist to monitor her pulse. Ethan took a sharp exit, then another until the buildings gave way to dense forest. The black SUVs gradually fell behind as Ethan navigated the increasingly remote roads with practiced skill. After what felt like hours, Ethan turned onto a nearly hidden dirt path. A small cabin emerged from the trees, weathered but solid. Ethan parked behind it, concealing the car from the main road. They helped Jay inside, laying her on a worn couch. Her color was better, but she remained weak and disoriented. Ethan moved quickly through the cabin, checking windows and doors, while Clara tended to Jay. "We'll be safe here for now," Ethan said, peering through the front window at the dense tree line. "This isn't over." Inside the remote cabin, Clara gently wrapped a blanket around Jay's shoulders as she sat on the worn couch. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes held a distant look that worried him. Ethan settled into a chair across from them, his notebook ready. "Take your time," Clara said softly. "Just tell us what you remember." Jay's voice came out barely above a whisper. "White rooms. So white, they hurt your eyes. And the people, they never showed their faces. always wearing masks or staying in shadows. Ethan leaned forward, his pen scratching against paper. What did they do in these rooms? Tests, so many tests. Jay's breathing quickened. But there was something else. They kept talking about the word, something they said could change everything. They made sure we forgot it. Nathan exchanged glances with Ethan, whose expression had grown grave. He watched as he pulled out a thick folder from his bag, spreading documents across the coffee table. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to a heavily redacted page. Reports of memory manipulation experiments at Solace Haven. But they weren't just erasing trauma. They were hiding something specific. Nathan began sorting through years of Ethan's collected research. Newspaper clippings, unofficial reports, photographs of abandoned facilities. As he matched them against Jay's descriptions, a pattern emerged. These aren't just random experiments, he realized, laying out the documents. The facility, the security, the specialized equipment, it's too elaborate for a simple orphanage program. Jay suddenly grabbed his arm, his eyes wide. "Files, I remember files. They made us handle them, but we couldn't read them. They were testing if we could sense something." "Encrypted information," Ethan muttered, scribbling frantically. They were using children as some kind of human processors. The pieces began falling into place. Nathan noticed recurring names in the documents: high-ranking military officials, government contractors, private security firms, all connected to Solace Haven through a web of shell companies and classified projects. "Your mind," Nathan said to Jay. "It might still hold information they need, that's why they're hunting you." The weight of this revelation proved too much for Jay. Her body began to shake as tears streamed down her face. Memories flooded back, the tests, the pain, the fear. Nathan pulled her close, letting her cry into his shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now, we'll find a way to make this right." Ethan stood by the window, his face etched with concern. "If we're right, this is bigger than anyone's imagined. But how do we fight it?" In the dim light of dawn, Ethan hunched over the cabin's kitchen table, his weathered hands carefully smoothing out the crumpled note Clara had found. Years of investigating conspiracies had taught him to spot patterns others might miss. The strange symbols, at first glance chaotic, began to form a familiar sequence under his trained eye. "These aren't random markings," he muttered, pulling out his laptop. "They're using an old military encoding system. Look here." He pointed to a series of curved lines. "These are coordinates." Nathan leaned over his shoulder, watching as he input the numbers into a mapping program. "Where does it lead?" "An abandoned mining complex outside the city," Ethan replied, zooming in on the satellite image. "But that's just the surface. Underground, there's a sophisticated bunker system. My sources have mentioned it before, but I've never been able to confirm its exact location." Jay, who had been quietly observing from the couch, suddenly straightened. I remember steel doors, long corridors with fluorescent lights, guards wearing black uniforms with red patches." Ethan nodded grimly. "Elite security contractors, they're hired by some of the most powerful people in the country. Senator Harrison, General Matthews, CEO Richard Cornell, all connected to this location through shell companies and classified contracts." Nathan spread out a rough map Ethan had drawn. "How do we even get close without being detected?" "The security is layered," Ethan explained, marking key points. "Motion sensors, infrared cameras, armed patrols. But every system has its weak points." Jay's voice trembled as more memories surfaced. "There's a service tunnel used for maintenance crews. They used it twice a month, the cameras. They have blind spots near the ventilation shafts." Ethan scribbled down Jay's observations, his expression intense. "This is invaluable intel. But we need to be careful. These people, they're not just security guards. They're connected to intelligence agencies, private military companies, even foreign interests." "We'll need supplies," Nathan said, his nursing instincts kicking in. "Medical equipment, communication devices, anything that could help us if things go wrong." "I have contacts who can help," Ethan replied. "But we'll need time to prepare. One wrong move, and we'll have the full force of their operation coming down on us." Jay's hands shook as she pointed to specific areas on the map. The main lab. It's 3 levels down. That's where they kept the most important files. But the security there, it's different. More intense. Ethan placed the decoded note on the table, his expression grave. This bunker isn't just a place. It's the heart of their operation. If we go there, we may not come back. Nathan looked at Jay, who nodded resolutely. Then, we have no choice, he said. Jay, Nathan, and Ethan huddled around a makeshift planning table. Jay's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she faced Clara's concerned gaze. I have to go with you, she insisted, her pale features set with determination. There are things in that bunker that only I can recognize. Nathan shook his head, his protective instincts flaring. You're barely recovered from our last escape. The strain could… I've seen the inside, Jay interrupted, her fingers tracing the blueprints spread before them. I know exactly what we're looking for. The files, the project records. They're all there. Ethan leaned forward, studying the building plans Nathan had obtained. She's right. We'd be walking in blind without her. But Nathan's concerns are valid too. They spent the next hour reviewing the bunker's layout. Ethan pointed to a maintenance entrance on the blueprint's corner. This is our way in. Security's lighter here, meant for utility crews. The cameras rotate every 3 minutes, Jay added, her memories becoming clearer. And the guards? They follow strict patterns. Under cover of night, they approach the facility. Ethan pulled out a small device, his fingers moving swiftly across its screen. The perimeter cameras went dark one by one. Nathan kept watch, his heart pounding as they made their way to the ventilation shaft. The shaft was cramped and cold. Metal groaned beneath them as they crawled through its narrow confines. Jay led the way, her movements careful but purposeful. Every sound echoed ominously around them. Their progress halted abruptly when footsteps approached the vent exit. A guard's shadow passed beneath them, forcing complete stillness. Nathan held his breath, watching Jay's shoulders tense. Seconds stretched into minutes before the guard moved on. Finally reaching their target, they faced the biometric lock securing the data storage room. Its sleek panel glowed softly in the dim corridor. There, Jay whispered, pointing to a control panel partially hidden behind a maintenance access door. That's how we bypass it. Ethan worked quickly, connecting his device to the panel. The security system began a reset sequence, but Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard. With seconds to spare, the lock disengaged. Inside the data storage room, Nathan pulled Jay aside. His eyes searched her face, noting the exhaustion etched there. Are you sure about this? He asked softly. There's still time to turn back. Jay met his gaze, fear visible in her eyes but mixed with unwavering determination. We need to know the truth, she replied. There's no other way. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Nathan, Jay, and Ethan moved through the sterile data storage room. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces reflecting the cold light. The soft hum of servers provided a constant background drone that matched Nathan's racing pulse. While he methodically worked through the physical files, Ethan's fingers flew across a console keyboard, accessing digital records. Jay stood between them, her eyes scanning the room until something caught her attention. A black and white photograph taped to a manila folder. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The image showed a group of children, and there in the center was her own face, years younger, but unmistakable. The other children stood in neat rows, their expressions vacant. Project Genesis was printed in bold letters across the Folders tab. Got it, Ethan muttered, his camera clicking steadily as he photographed each document they uncovered. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. Jay? Nathan's whisper cut through her daze. Stay with us. We need to keep moving. As they dug deeper, the horrifying truth of the facility emerged through clinical reports and detailed logs. The documents revealed systematic genetic manipulation performed on children, alongside intensive psychological conditioning programs. The term, "the word," appeared repeatedly in the margins and headers, though its meaning remained obscure. Jay's breathing grew irregular as memories crashed over her. sterile examination rooms, the sting of needles, stern voices issuing commands she couldn't quite remember. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The sudden blare of an alarm shattered the silence. Ethan's head snapped up from the console. "Silent alert trigger," he said tersely, his fingers racing to erase their digital footprints. "We've got company coming." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each second. Nathan grabbed Jay's hand, pulling her toward a side door they'd identified as their backup escape route. Ethan finished his work at the console, wiping away the last traces of their presence in the system. The sound of boots on tile grew closer as multiple guards converged on their position. The trio ducked into a supply closet, holding their breath as uniformed figures rushed past. Jay clutched the photograph, her knuckles white, but her grip unwavering. In the cramped darkness, Nathan leaned close. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, though his voice wasn't entirely steady. Outside, they could hear the guards coordinating their search, voices splitting off in different directions. As Crow's team emerged from multiple doorways, their movements precise and practiced, Nathan and Ethan barely had time to react before guards tackled them to the ground, securing their hands behind their backs with zip ties that bit into their skin. Jay, showing remarkable presence of mind, slipped silently behind a stack of storage crates. Crow stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. His face remained calm, almost pleasant, as he looked down at Nathan. "You're in over your head," he said softly, "and you don't even know why." Nathan met his gaze with defiance, subtly moving his fingers to signal Jay to stay hidden. Crow continued speaking, seemingly oblivious to Jay's presence. "What you've stumbled into," Crow said, pacing slowly, "goes far beyond a few unethical experiments. There are people in positions of power who would do anything to keep these secrets buried." Guards separated Nathan and Ethan, dragging Nathan to a stark interrogation room. The metal chair was cold against his back as Crow settled into the seat across from him. His expression remained unchanged, but his eyes held a predatory gleam. "The girl is still in the building," Crow stated matter-of-factly. "He holds the key to everything. You understand that, don't you?" Nathan's face remained neutral, though his heart raced. The word isn't just a program or a command. It's so much more. Nathan's voice dripped with contempt. "You experimented on children, you're monsters." Crow actually chuckled. Such a simple view of complex matters. Meanwhile, Jay crawled through the ventilation system, her small frame allowing her to move quietly through the metal passages. She paused above the interrogation room, hearing Crow's voice drift up through the vents. The files she carried felt heavy with importance as she pieced together fragments of conversation, mentions of powerful figures, cover-ups, and the true scope of what they'd discovered. Through the vent slats, Jay could see Nathan sitting straight-backed in his chair, refusing to give Crow any satisfaction. He watched as he deflected question after question, buying her precious time to escape with the evidence. Jay reached the end of the ventilation shaft, carefully pushing open an access panel. She emerged into an empty corridor, clutching the stolen files against her chest. Looking back toward where he knew Nathan and Ethan were being held, she took a deep breath. Despite her fear, she couldn't leave them behind. Jay crept along the dimly lit corridor, her heart pounding but her movement steady. Ahead, a security guard stood lazily against the wall, a ring of keys dangling from his belt. Jay remembered the times she'd had to be quick and quiet in the facility before, skills she'd rather forget, but now proved invaluable. Moving with calculated steps, Jay approached from behind. Her small frame allowed her to stay in the guard's blind spot. With trembling fingers, she reached for the keys, carefully unhooking them while the guard checked his phone. The metal felt cold in her palm as she withdrew, holding her breath until she was safely around the corner. Finding the interrogation rooms took longer than she'd hoped. Each moment felt like an eternity as she tried different keys in various locks. Finally, one clicked. Inside, Nathan and Ethan sat bound to chairs, their faces showing signs of rough handling. "Jay, no!" Nathan whispered urgently. Get out of here, while you can." But Jay ignored his protests, working quickly to unlock their restraints. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness despite the danger. Once free, the trio navigated through the bunker's maze-like corridors. Jay took point, using her size to peek around corners and through gaps. Several times, they pressed themselves into alcoves or ducked into empty rooms as patrol groups passed by. Their luck ran out near the east wing when 2 guards spotted them. Jay's mind raced as she spotted a fire alarm on the wall. Without hesitation, she pulled it. The shrieking alarm sent guards running toward predetermined stations, creating chaos that Nathan and Ethan used to their advantage. They quickly overpowered the confused guards who had spotted them. Racing through the now noisy corridors, they reached the utility exit, only to find it sealed with an electronic lock that hadn't been there before. "They've locked down the exits," Ethan muttered, examining the keypad with growing concern. They could hear boots thundering down distant hallways as more guards responded to the alarm. In the safe house's dim light, Jay sat on a worn couch, her fingers nervously tapping against her knee. Nathan remained beside her, his voice gentle yet persistent as he helped her navigate through the fog of her memories. Across the room, Ethan's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, attempting to piece together the fragments of data they'd managed to retrieve. "Take your time," Nathan said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Jay's shoulder. "Just breathe, and let the memories come naturally." Jay closed her eyes, her face tightening as images flickered through her mind. Sterile white walls, the echo of footsteps down long corridors, whispered conversations in the dark. "There were others," she said, her voice barely audible. "We weren't supposed to talk about freedom. They said it was dangerous." Ethan looked up from his screen. Any specific phrases they used, something that might serve as a password? Jay's breathing quickened as more memories surfaced. A girl with red hair, speaking in hushed tones during their brief moments alone. Her face was clear in her mind now, determined despite her fear. "There was someone," Jay said, sitting up straighter. "Sarah. She told me something important." Her hands trembled as the memory crystallized. She said, "Freedom will set us free." The moment she spoke those words, recognition flashed across his face. Ethan's fingers immediately moved to the keyboard, typing in the phrase. The screen flickered and suddenly rows of encrypted files began unlocking. "This is it," Ethan breathed, his eyes scanning the data. Financial records, lists of children, political connections. It's all here. Nathan leaned forward, his face pale as he read the documents over Ethan's shoulder. The evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, detailed logs of experiments, and names of powerful figures who had supported the program. "Look at these dates," Ethan said, pointing to the screen. "This goes back decades. The reach of this operation, it's global." Jay stared at the screen, her eyes reflecting both the blue glow of the monitor and a mix of fear and resolve. Nathan wrapped his arm around her shoulders protectively. "We'll bring them to justice," he promised firmly, his voice steady despite the weight of their discovery. In a dimly lit basement office, Ethan hunched over multiple computer screens, his eyes bloodshot from endless hours of organizing the explosive evidence. Empty coffee cups littered his desk as he meticulously authenticated each document, cross-referencing dates and names to create an ironclad case against Solace Haven. Nathan paced nearby, his phone constantly buzzing with messages from journalists, lawyers, and activists. "The Washington Post is ready to run with it," he said, checking another message. "They've got their best team on standby." Ethan nodded without looking up. "Good. We need reputable outlets. The bigger, the better." He paused, rubbing his tired eyes. "These people won't go down without a fight." As if confirming his words, Nathan's phone lit up with another message, this time a thinly veiled threat. "They're getting nervous," he said, showing Ethan the message. "We must be close." The next morning, the story broke like a tsunami. Major news outlets simultaneously published detailed exposés, their headlines screaming about decades of abuse and corruption. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice while clips from the leaked videos went viral. Within hours, survivors began emerging from the shadows. A woman in Seattle shared her story of being subjected to experimental treatments. A man in Boston revealed documents he'd hidden for years, afraid to come forward alone. Each new testimony strengthened their case, creating a web of evidence too vast to ignore. Jay watched from the safe house as more survivors appeared on news channels. Her hands trembled as she recognized faces from her fragmented memories. Children who had shared her fears in those sterile white rooms. "That's Sarah," she whispered, pointing to a red-haired woman being interviewed. "She was the one who told me about freedom." Nathan sat beside her, watching as federal agents led handcuffed executives and politicians to waiting vehicles. The arrests played out on live television, captivating millions. Public outrage grew with each new revelation, forcing law enforcement to act swiftly. News anchors struggled to keep up with the developments. "Another high-profile arrest today," one reported, standing outside a federal building. Sources say more indictments are pending. Behind him, protesters held signs demanding justice for the survivors. The camera panned across their faces, determined, angry, hopeful. In their secure location, Jay watched it all unfold. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "We did it." The autumn evening cast shadows across the gathered crowd, their candles flickering like stars against the darkening sky. Jay stood at the podium, her voice steady despite her nerves. Hundreds of faces looked up at her, many streaked with tears, all united in their shared experience. "We are more than survivors," Jay said, her words carrying across the hushed crowd. "We are witnesses. We are truth tellers. And now, we are free." Her hands gripped the podium tightly, but her voice remained strong and clear. Nathan watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride. The frightened girl he'd found in the hospital had transformed into a beacon of hope for others. He remembered her first days of terror, her whispered warnings, and marveled at his journey from victim to advocate. After the vigil, survivors approached Jay, sharing quiet words and grateful embraces. Some showed her photographs of their own healing journeys, reunions with family, graduations, weddings. Others spoke of starting support groups and advocacy organizations. In his office the next day, Nathan carefully filled out adoption papers, each line bringing Jay closer to having the family she deserved. He smiled at the thought of giving her his last name, of making official what his heart had known for months. She was his daughter. Across town, Ethan sat in his cramped office, studying an email that had arrived anonymously. The message was brief, but concerning. Solace Haven wasn't alone. Others still operate. We'll send proof. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The success of exposing Solace Haven had inspired a wave of change. Former victims were rebuilding their lives, supporting each other through a new foundation they'd created. Some had become counselors, others lawyers or activists. Their shared trauma had forged an unbreakable network of support. Jay's story had become a symbol of resilience featured in documentaries and textbooks. But more importantly, she was healing. The nightmares came less frequently now, and her smile reached her eyes more often than not. Nathan's decision to adopt Jay felt natural, like putting a name to something that already existed. When he told her, her eyes had filled with tears, and she'd hugged him tightly, whispering "Dad" for the first time. As Ethan began investigating the new lead, he kept his findings quiet, protecting Jay and Nathan's hard-won peace. A manila envelope arrived on his desk, containing a flash drive and a handwritten note. He looked through his office window, watching Nathan and Jay leave the building together, their laughter carrying across the parking lot. The small two-story house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Nathan watched as Jay explored her new bedroom, running her hands over the freshly painted blue walls. He had let him choose the color herself, her first real decision in her new life. "It's really mine?" she asked, her voice soft with disbelief. "All yours," Nathan replied, setting down a box of her belongings. "We can decorate it however you want." The first few weeks were filled with gentle adjustments. Nathan helped Jay establish routines: breakfast together before school, homework at the kitchen table, therapy sessions twice a week with Dr. Sanders. He noticed how she still checked the locks at night and kept her backpack packed with emergency supplies. At school, Jay struggled to connect with her classmates. During lunch, she sat alone, picking at her food and watching others from a distance. Some kids made fun of her quietness, calling her weird and freak. One day, she came home with tears in her eyes after a boy had knocked her books out of her hands. Nathan's heart ached as he held her. "You're so much stronger than they know," he whispered, stroking her hair. "But you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to feel hurt." He spoke with her teachers, worked with the school counselor, and helped Jay develop coping strategies. Slowly, she began to find her footing. In art class, her detailed drawings caught the attention of another quiet boy named Marcus, who shared Jay's interest in comics. The neighborhood spring festival marked a turning point. Nathan watched from a distance as Jay helped run the face painting booth with Marcus. For the first time, he heard her laugh freely, a sound that made his eyes well up with tears. "She's doing better," Ethan remarked, appearing beside him with cotton candy in hand. She still checked in regularly, though his investigations kept him busy. "He is," Clara agreed, watching Jay paint a butterfly on a little girl's cheek. "But sometimes I worry I'm not doing enough." "Look at him," Ethan said softly. "Really look. That's a kid who feels safe and loved. You're doing just fine." Back home that evening, Jay carefully arranged his room, placing his art supplies on his desk and his books on the new shelves. Clara helped him hang up some of his drawings, stepping back to admire his work. With gentle hands, Jay picked up a framed photograph from the festival. Him and Clara, both smiling widely, faces speckled with paint. He placed it on his bedside table, right where he could see it from his bed. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart full. They still had challenges ahead, but this moment, this simple act of claiming space and creating home, felt like a victory worth celebrating. The autumn wind whipped through the empty park as Ethan sat on a weathered bench, waiting for his contact. A woman in a gray coat approached, her steps hurried and nervous. She glanced over her shoulder before sitting beside him. "They never really shut down," she whispered, passing him a manila envelope. "Solace Haven was just one branch of something bigger." Across town, Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the same black sedan that had been parked down the street for 3 nights straight. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug as she noted the tinted windows and lack of license plates. Ethan flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. Financial records showed money flowing through shell companies, connecting former Solace Haven operators to new facilities. Later that evening, as Ethan walked to his car, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall and dressed in black, the stranger's face remained hidden beneath a hood. "Some truths are better left buried," the figure said, voice low and distorted. Before Ethan could respond, the stranger dropped a small piece of paper and melted back into the darkness. Clara installed new security cameras around the house, careful to maintain a sense of normalcy for Jay's sake. She added extra locks to the windows and programmed emergency numbers into Jay's phone. When he asked about the changes, she smiled and called it home improvement. Jay noticed the tension in Clara's shoulders when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw how she checked the windows more frequently and how her eyes darted to the street whenever a car drove past. But he trusted her, felt safe in the cocoon of protection she had built around them. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the note left by the mysterious figure. The single word, Concordia, seemed to mock him from the paper. His research had hit walls at every turn, but this word, this might be the key he needed. That night, Nathan moved through Jay's bedtime routine with extra care. He checked her homework, listened to her talk about her art class, and sat with her while she read. When it was time for lights out, he lingered by the switch, watching her peaceful face. "Good night, Jay," he whispered, making a silent vow to keep the darkness at bay. Miles away, Ethan spread his research across his desk, the word Concordia at the center of his growing web of connections. His eyes reflected the determination of someone who knew the fight was far from over. Jay stepped off the yellow school bus, her hand firmly clasped in Nathan's as they took in their new surroundings. The small town of Cedar Grove spread before them, its tree-lined streets and well-kept homes painting a picture of tranquility. Nathan had chosen this place carefully, drawn to its reputation for supporting families like theirs. "What do you think?" Nathan asked softly, giving Jay's hand a gentle squeeze. Jay's eyes darted around, taking in the peaceful scene. The autumn breeze rustled through maple trees, and distant laughter echoed from a nearby playground. She nodded slightly, though her shoulders remained tense. Their new home sat on a quiet street, a modest two-story house with warm yellow siding and white trim. Nathan led Jay up the walkway, past flower beds that needed attention, but held promise. Inside, sunlight streamed through large windows, filling the space with natural warmth. The next morning, Jay stood before her new classroom, her heart pounding. Mrs. Daniels, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, welcomed her with a gentle smile. She noticed her trembling hands and quietly arranged her desk near her own, giving her space while keeping her close. During lunch period, Jay sat alone until a girl with unruly red hair approached her table. "I'm Etsy," the girl said, gesturing to an empty seat. "Want to join us?" She pointed to a small group of students who waved encouragingly. Jay hesitated, but something in Etsy's easy smile made him pick up his lunch tray and follow. The conversation flowed naturally to art class and soccer, topics that sparked Jay's interest. For the first time in years, he found himself participating in casual conversation, even sharing a laugh when Liam told a silly joke about their art teacher's paint-splattered apron. That evening, Nathan attended his first meeting at the local foster parent support group. The community center's warm lighting and circle of chairs created an intimate atmosphere. As other parents shared their stories of challenges and triumphs, Nathan felt his shoulders relax. These people understood the unique journey he and Jay were on. A mother named Sarah described how her foster daughter had finally called her mom after 2 years, bringing tears to everyone's eyes. Another parent offered practical advice about handling school transitions. Nathan took notes, absorbing their wisdom and feeling less alone in his determination to give Jay the life she deserved. When Jay joined the after-school art program, her talent for drawing emerged. Her art teacher praised her attention to detail, especially in a sketch of the blue jay that had once watched over her in the hospital. The memory, once painful, transformed into something beautiful on paper. Later, Elsie invited Jay to join their pickup soccer games during recess. Though initially hesitant to participate, Jay found herself looking forward to the daily matches. Her natural agility made her a valuable team member, and the physical activity helped release her anxiety. The day ended with Jay bursting through the front door, her face flushed from playing soccer with her new friends. Nathan watched from the kitchen as she excitedly described scoring her first goal, her hands gesturing animatedly. Her laughter, once so rare, filled their home with joy. As Jay hugged him goodnight, Nathan whispered, "You're doing amazing, Jay." She held on a moment longer than usual, and he felt the trust they'd built in that simple embrace. Nathan sat at his oak desk, surrounded by photographs and letters spread out before him. Each piece of paper told a story of hope. Children finding homes, families healing, lives transformed. His fingers traced over a particularly moving letter from a teenage girl who'd found stability after years of uncertainty. His eyes fell on the first photo he'd taken with Jay, back when she was still in the hospital. The memory of that decisive moment when he chose to become her foster father flooded back. He remembered the mix of fear and determination he'd felt, knowing it would change both their lives forever. At the community center, Nathan stood before a gathered crowd of local leaders, foster parents, and former foster children. Banners announcing the New Horizons Foundation hung on the walls, while tables displayed information about foster care programs and resources. Jay had set up her artwork on easels near the entrance. Her pieces told a story through colors and shadows. Early works showed dark, confined spaces, while her recent paintings burst with light and hope. Visitors stopped to study each piece, moved by the visual journey from isolation to belonging. When I first met Jay, Nathan addressed the crowd, his voice steady but emotional. She was alone and afraid. Today she's thriving, and her story reminds us that every child deserves a chance at happiness. He outlined his vision for the foundation, detailing programs to support both children and foster families. During the presentations, Jay stood near her artwork, answering questions when asked, but Nathan noticed her hands trembling slightly as more people approached to discuss her pieces. He made his way to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's bringing up a lot, isn't it?" he asked softly. Jay nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to feel so exposed." "Your story helps others understand," Nathan assured her. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed. Being vulnerable takes courage." As the event continued, other foster children shared their success stories. A young woman spoke about graduating college, while a teenage boy described finding his passion for music after years of silence. Each story added momentum to Nathan's vision. The community's response exceeded expectations. Local business owners pledged support, and experienced foster parents volunteered to mentor newcomers to the program. Jay's artwork attracted several buyers, with all proceeds going to the foundation. Later that evening, Nathan watched Jay laughing with a group of teens who'd shared similar experiences. Her smile reached her eyes now, something that had taken months to achieve. He felt tears of gratitude welling up as he observed the confident young woman she was becoming. At home, Jay approached Nathan as he arranged the day's donation checks on the kitchen counter. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me when nobody else did." Nathan pulled her into a tight hug, both of them understanding how one choice to persevere had created ripples of change far beyond themselves. On a bright spring morning, sunlight filtered through the wispy clouds as Jay and Nathan stood in their backyard, surveying the perfect spot for their special planting. Jay clutched a young maple sapling in her hands, her eyes bright with anticipation. "This is where our freedom tree will grow," Jay announced, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Right here, where we can see it from the kitchen window." Nathan smiled warmly, watching as Jay carefully placed the sapling on the grass. He had brought out 2 shovels, gardening gloves, and a watering can. The morning air carried the sweet scent of nearby flowering bushes, and birds chirped merrily in the surrounding trees. As they began to dig together, Nathan shared stories from his own childhood. "When I was about your age," he said, pausing to wipe his brow, "I used to help at the local community center. That's when I knew I wanted to spend my life helping children." Jay nodded thoughtfully, her movement steady as she worked the soil. "I think I know what I want to do too," she said. "I want to be an artist, but not just for myself. I want to teach other kids how to express themselves through art, like Mrs. Daniels helped me do." Their conversation flowed naturally as they prepared the ground, mixing in rich soil and creating the perfect foundation for the young tree. Jay's face glowed with pride as she carefully positioned the sapling, making sure it stood straight and tall. "It needs to face the sun," she explained, adjusting it slightly. "Just like how you helped me find my way toward the light." As they patted down the soil around the base of the tree, several neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Johnson from next door brought over a pitcher of lemonade, while Mr. Peterson praised Jay's recent art show at the community center. "You've really found your calling," Mr. Peterson said warmly. "This tree is going to grow strong and beautiful just like you." Jay beamed at the compliment as she retrieved something from behind a garden bench, a small wooden plaque she'd made in art class. The words, "Growth through love and hope," were carefully painted in bright colors, decorated with intricate designs of leaves and branches. Together, Jay and Nathan secured the plaque near the base of the tree. They stood back to admire their work, Jay's arm wrapped around Nathan's waist, both of them taking in the significance of the moment. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, Jay and Nathan settled under the young tree. Jay pulled out her sketchbook, her pencil moving confidently across the page as she captured the scene before them. Nathan sat beside her, a book in his lap, occasionally glancing at her progress with pride. The golden light of sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the newly planted freedom tree, a living symbol of their journey together and the promise of growth to come. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.